Steele, replied Peter. I see, said John. But do you think Bob Steele will meet us at the station at 3:30? I expect he will, said Peter, unless you made him too angry. Do you want to come to the post office with me? No, thanks, answered John. I can look after myself. I'll go straight to the railway station and meet you there. All right, said Peter. Do as you like. See you at the station at 3:30. See you then, said John. Then John walked off down the road towards the river. He watched the ships unloading for a while. Then he walked back up the hill towards the station. He went into the station and sat on a seat. There were lots of people in the station and no one noticed him. He watched the trains come and go. The time passed quickly, and looking at the station clock, John saw to his surprise that it was already 3:30. He couldn't see either Peter or Bob Steele. John got up and walked over to the clock. 5 minutes passed. He began to wonder what had happened. Suddenly, 2 men walked up to him. I wonder what they want, thought John. Perhaps they want to ask the way. John Stevens, the first man said. I am Detective Inspector Shaw. You are under arrest for the murder of your uncle. They were policemen. John looked around to see if he could escape, but the second policeman put his hand on John's shoulder. Don't try to run away, said the policeman. You'd better come with us. The policeman took John outside the railway station, where there was a police car waiting. They put John into the back seat, and Detective Inspector Shaw got in beside him. The other policeman got into the driving seat and started the car. As they were driving off, John looked back at the station and saw Peter looking at the car. Why did you do it? Asked Detective Inspector Shaw. Do what? Replied John. Kill your uncle, said Inspector Shaw. I didn't kill my uncle, said John angrily. Oh, yes, you did, said Inspector Shaw, looking closely at John. We know you did. John did not reply. When the police car arrived at the police station, the policeman took John inside. They put him in a small room with no window and told him to wait there. There was no chair, and John was soon tired of standing, so he sat down on the floor. A few minutes later, Inspector Shaw came in. He saw John sitting on the floor and told him to stand up. John stood up. Are you going to tell us all about the murder now? Asked Inspector Shaw roughly. John didn't reply. He looked at the floor. Look at me, boy, shouted the policeman. John looked up. Now tell me the truth, said Inspector Shaw. Tell me why you killed your uncle. I didn't, started John. I see, interrupted Inspector Shaw. So you want to be difficult, do you? Inspector Shaw went out of the room and banged the door. John sat down again, but as soon as he did so, the door opened and he was told to stand up. After about an hour, another policeman came in, smiled, and said hello to John. I'm Sergeant Black, he said. Are you John? Yes, John replied. Sergeant Black brought 2 chairs, and he and John sat down. I expect you're thirsty, said Sergeant Black. Would you like a cup of tea? Yes, please, said John with a smile. He liked this policeman much more than Inspector Shaw. Sergeant Black brought in 2 cups of tea and a plate of cakes. Now then, said Sergeant Black kindly, what's all this about? John didn't reply. You can trust me, said Sergeant Black. I'll understand. John liked Sergeant Black and he liked the tea, so he started to answer the sergeant's questions. Did you like your uncle? Asked the sergeant. No, said John slowly. Not very much. Where have you been for the last 2 days? Asked Sergeant Black. I've been to... John stopped. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Sergeant Black got up and went out. John sat and thought for a minute. I must be more careful, he thought. I nearly said that I had been to Manchester. That would get Peter into trouble for helping me. Sergeant Black still hadn't come back. but John could hear his voice. He went up to the door and listened. Sergeant Black was talking to Inspector Shaw. "He's starting to talk now," said Sergeant Black. "Good," replied Inspector Shaw. "He'll tell you everything now." John went back to his chair and sat down. That was lucky, he thought. It had all been a trick to make him talk. Sergeant Black and Inspector Shaw were working together. Sergeant Black came back into the room. "Now," he said with a smile. "Where were we? Oh yes, you were just telling me that you had been to... I don't remember now. Where was it you said you had been?" "I haven't been anywhere," said John, "and I'm not telling you anything." "Now, don't be stupid," said Sergeant Black. "If you didn't kill your uncle, you haven't got anything to be afraid of, have you? Tell me all about it and I'll see if I can help you." John said nothing. Sergeant Black tried asking more questions, but John didn't reply. After a while, the sergeant put John in another room with a bed and locked the door. "Can I have some food, please?" John asked. "Yes," the policeman replied. "You can have some food when you've told us the truth." Chapter 11. Peter finds Bob Steele. Peter looked at the police car as it drove away from the railway station. He thought that he could see John inside the car. Peter looked again. Yes, it was John. The police had caught John at the railway station. Peter ran into the station and looked under the clock, but there was no one there. But where was Bob Steele? Perhaps Bob Steele had already left, or perhaps he had seen the police and run away. Or perhaps Bob Steele had told the police that John would be waiting at the station at 3:30. Peter turned around angrily and left the station. Peter went back to River Street to collect his lorry. He also wanted to talk to Bob Steele again. He wanted to find out if Bob Steele had told the police about John and if he knew anything more about the murder. When Peter arrived at River Street, he was still feeling very angry. Peter banged on the front door of Bob's home, but there was no answer. He waited for a moment and then banged again. There was still no answer. Peter tried to look in the front windows, but he couldn't see anything because the curtains were all closed. He went around to the back of the house and banged on the back door. There was no answer. Right, thought Peter. If Bob Steele is at home, he'll have to go out at some time. If he's out, he'll return home in the end. So I'll wait for him. Peter walked back to the front of the house and drove his lorry around the corner, out of sight. Then Peter went into the cafe on the corner, where he and John had waited at lunchtime. He sat at a table at the window, from which he could watch Bob Steele's front door. It was just after 4 o'clock. Peter drank a cup of tea and waited. By 5 o'clock, Bob Steele still had not appeared. Peter drank another cup of tea and ate some biscuits. At 6 o'clock he went out, bought a newspaper, and returned to the cafe. He looked at the front page of the newspaper. Peter pushed the newspaper away angrily. So it was true. John was under arrest. Peter asked for another cup of tea. At 6:30, he decided not to wait for Bob Steele any longer. He was just leaving the cafe when he suddenly stopped. He could see Bob Steele walking quickly along the street away from number 12. Peter decided to follow him. Bob Steele went towards the center of the town and Peter followed him. When Bob Steele stopped to cross the road, Peter hid in a doorway. When Bob Steele looked around, Peter hid behind his newspaper. After a few minutes, Bob Steele stopped at a bus stop. Peter waited in a shop doorway, pretending to read his newspaper. The bus came and Bob Steele got on. Peter followed and sat close to the door of the bus, so that he could watch Bob Steele without being seen. Peter wasn't sure what ticket he should buy, so he asked to go to the center of town and hoped that Bob Steele would get off there. Peter was right. Bob Steele got off at the bus station in the center of the town. Here, it was easier for Peter to follow because there were more people. Soon, Bob Steele turned into a narrow side street. Peter followed him. But when Peter turned the corner, he was surprised to see that the side street was empty. Peter walked along the side street slowly and carefully, stopping every few meters to listen. Halfway down the street, he could hear voices coming from a dark shop doorway. He went close to the doorway and listened. Peter could hear Bob Steele's voice, but couldn't hear all the words. Peter could only hear some of the words Bob Steele was saying. Told you, trust me, the police, arrest, railway station. Peter moved closer to try to hear what Bob Steele was saying. Suddenly, Peter bumped into a tin which was lying on the ground. The tin made a loud noise. Bob Steele and the person he was with stopped talking. Peter jumped back and tried to hide, but it was too late. "There's someone there," shouted Bob Steele, and he and the person he was talking to ran off down the street. Peter ran after them. He could see both of them clearly as they ran ahead of him. The person Bob Steele had been talking to looked quite young, about 15 or 16 years old. At the end of the street, Bob Steele turned to the right, and the boy he had been talking to turned to the left. "What shall I do?" thought Peter. "Which one should I follow?" He decided to run after Bob Steele. He ran as fast as he could and slowly got closer and closer to Bob Steele. Bob Steele looked over his shoulder at Peter and tried to run faster. But Peter caught up with him and took hold of his coat. Bob Steele tried to get free, but he couldn't escape. Peter caught hold of Bob Steele's arm and twisted it behind his back. "Now," said Peter, "you're going to tell me the truth." Chapter 12. More information. "Come on," said Peter. "Tell me the truth." But Bob Steele didn't say anything, so Peter twisted his arm a bit more. "Ow!" cried Bob Steele. "Stop it." "I'll stop it when you start talking," replied Peter. "All right," said Bob Steele, "but I can't talk here. Let's go back to my house and I'll tell you there." "I've got a better idea," said Peter. "We'll walk back to your house and you can tell me what you know as we walk." "Okay," said Bob Steele, "but please leave go of my arm." Peter laughed. "No," he said. "I don't want you to run away again." Then they started walking back to River Street. "Now," said Peter, "did you send the police to the railway station?" Bob Steele shook his head. "No," he said. "I didn't do it." Peter twisted Bob Steele's arm. "I don't believe you," he said. "Why did you send the police to the station? Was it for money?" "No," said Bob Steele. "They didn't give me very much." Then he was silent. "Very much what?" asked Peter quickly. "They didn't give you very much money. So you did tell the police that John was at the station, but they didn't pay you very well." Bob Steele didn't reply. They both walked in silence for a moment. "Who were you talking to?" asked Peter. "When?" said Bob Steele. "When I caught you," replied Peter. "I was talking to myself," said Bob Steele. "No, you weren't," Peter said firmly. "I saw you talking to a boy. Who was he?" Bob Steele didn't answer. They walked on in silence again, and were soon back outside number 12 River Street again. "Open the door," Peter told Bob Steele. "We haven't finished our conversation yet." When they were sitting in the upstairs room again, Peter leant forward and started to speak seriously to Bob Steele. "Now, let's be honest with each other. You make your living by selling information. You sold information about my friend John to the police." Bob Steele opened his mouth to speak, but Peter ignored him and continued. "You sold John to the police," said Peter, "but the police didn't pay you very much, so someone else must have paid you as well. Someone else must have given you money to tell the police where John was. Am I right?" Bob Steele looked at the floor and didn't reply. Peter went on. "I think that the person who paid you to tell the police where John was must have had a reason. I think he must have had a good reason to want to see John arrested by the police. Do you know what reason?" Bob Steele shook his head. No, I don't. Well, I do, said Peter. I think the person who paid you money to get John arrested was the murderer. Now, tell me the name of the person who paid you. Tell me his name. Bob Steele looked up. You don't understand, mister, he said. I don't tell people things. I sell information. If you want to know anything more, you'll have to pay me. Peter raised his hand angrily to hit Bob Steele. Don't hit me, Bob Steele shouted. If you hit me, I won't tell you anything. Peter lowered his hand and smiled. You would sell your own mother if you could, he said. All right, I'll pay you. How much do you want? You promised me 80 pounds, said Bob Steele quickly. That's right, answered Peter, and he took out the money. He held the money out to Bob Steele. Here you are, Peter continued. Tell me the name of the person who paid you to get John arrested. Bob Steele took the money and counted it. Then he put it in a pocket of his old coat. Well, he said, I'm afraid I can't tell you the name. What? Shouted Peter angrily. Wait a moment. Let me explain, said Bob Steele. I can't tell you the name because I don't know it, but I can tell you two things. What are they? Asked Peter. Firstly, said Bob Steele slowly, that everything I told you this afternoon was true. Tell me what you said this afternoon again, said Peter. Very well, said Bob Steele. I told you that Mr. Stevens wasn't killed for money. He was killed by someone who knew him. He was killed by someone young. What's the second thing you have to tell me? Peter asked. Just this, replied Bob Steele. If you go to Manor Park Secondary School, you will find the answers to all your questions. How will I find the murderer at Manor Park Secondary School? Asked Peter in surprise. Mr. Stevens was a teacher there, answered Bob Steele. Peter stood up quickly. I'm going to go there now, he said. But I may have some more questions to ask you, especially if I find that you haven't been telling me the truth. I think I'll tie you up to make sure that you don't go out while I'm away. Peter picked up a piece of rope which was lying on the floor. He tied Bob Steele to the chair in which he was sitting. Then Peter ran down the stairs and out of the house, leaving the front door partly open. Manor Park Secondary School was on the other side of Bristol. It was lucky that the lorry was around the corner. Peter got into the lorry and drove off to the school very fast. Chapter 13. In the Cafe. Peter stopped the lorry outside Manor Park Secondary School. Then he looked at his watch. It was already 8 o'clock. The school looked dark and closed. Peter got out of the lorry and then he noticed that there was a light on in one of the rooms. Peter went over to the window and looked in. There was a man of about 60 cleaning the floor of the classroom. Peter knocked at the window and the man looked up. The man saw Peter and opened the window. What do you want? The man asked. I'd like to have a talk with you, Peter replied. I'm very busy at the moment, the man said. It's about Mr. Stevens, Peter said. Oh, replied the man. You'd better come in then and we can have a talk. The man was the school caretaker. He cleaned the rooms and took care of the building. The caretaker let Peter in, and they sat down in the caretaker's room together. What do you want to know about Mr. Stevens? Asked the caretaker carefully. Are you from the newspapers? Peter shook his head. No, he said, and I'm not from the police either. I'm a friend of Mr. Stevens's nephew, John. Ah, yes, said the caretaker. John has been arrested by the police. Peter nodded. That's right, he said. But I think the police are wrong. I don't think John killed his uncle. Did you know Mr. Stevens well? Yes, replied the caretaker as he lit a cigarette. I've been working here for nearly 20 years, and Mr. Stevens had been here for 10 years. What was Mr. Stevens like? Asked Peter. The caretaker thought for a moment before saying anything. He was always very pleasant to me, the caretaker continued, but his pupils did not like him. Why not? Asked Peter. Mr. Stevens lost his temper very quickly, said the caretaker. He got angry very easily. He had fixed ideas about his pupils. Once he got the idea that a particular pupil was bad, he would never change his opinion. Did Mr. Stevens ever hit his pupils? Asked Peter. I think so, replied the caretaker, but it would be better for you to ask some of the boys themselves. Where can I find some of them now? Asked Peter. A lot of the boys go to a cafe about 1 kilometer from here, close to the Scala Cinema, the caretaker replied. If you go there, you'll find some of Mr. Stevens' pupils. Peter thanked the caretaker. He left the school and drove down to the cafe which the caretaker had told him about. The cafe was dark inside, and the radio was playing very loudly. A crowd of boys and girls aged 15 or 16 were standing by the door. Peter went up to them, said hello, and then asked them if they knew Mr. Stevens. Stevens, said one of the boys. I'm glad he's dead. He was terrible. Why was he terrible? Asked Peter. Mr. Stevens used to make us look stupid. He used to make jokes about our clothes and say how stupid we were all the time, the boy explained. My father's in prison, said another boy, and Mr. Stevens used to make jokes about it in every lesson. He used to ask me if I was going to be a thief like my father. Stevens used to hit us too, said another boy. Why? Peter asked. He used to hit us all the time, the boy replied. He hit us if we were late, or if we didn't answer his questions correctly. What was Mr. Stevens like in school on the day he was killed? Peter asked the group of boys. It's funny you should ask that, said one of the boys, because he had a big argument in our class that day. What was the argument about? Inquired Peter. I don't remember now, said the boy. I think it was because Mr. Stevens said that a boy had been rude to him. The boy said he hadn't, but Mr. Stevens shouted at him and gave him a lot of extra homework to do. What was the name of this boy? Asked Peter. I think it was Tommy Logan, said another boy. Peter thanked the boys for their help and asked them where he could find Tommy Logan. Tommy could be anywhere, one of them said. He's got a motorbike, but he usually comes here to the cafe at about 9 o'clock.